So the carbon cycle. Biological importance. Carbon forms the framework of the organic molecules essential to all organisms. Forms available to life. Photosynthetic organisms utilize CO2 during photosynthesis and convert the carbon to organic forms that are used by consumers, including animals, fungi, and heterotrophic protists and prokaryotes. Reservoirs. The major reservoirs of carbon include fossil fuels, soils, the sediments of aquatic ecosystems, the oceans, particularly dissolved carbon compounds, plant and animal biomass, and the atmosphere, CO2. The largest reservoir is sedimentary rocks, such as limestone. However, carbon remains in this pool for long periods of time. All organisms are capable of returning carbon directly to the environment in its original form, CO2, via respiration. Key processes. Photosynthesis by plants and phytoplankton remove substantial amounts of atmospheric CO2 each year. This quantity is approximately equal to the CO2 added to the atmosphere through cellular respiration by producers and consumers. The burning of fossil fuels and wood is adding to significant amounts of additional CO2 to the atmosphere. Over geologic time, volcanoes are also a substantial source of CO2. The nitrogen cycle. Biological importance. Nitrogen is part of amino acids, proteins, and nucleic acids and is often a limiting plant nutrient. Forms available to life. Plants can assimilate, use two inorganic forms of nitrogen, ammonium and nitrate, and some organic forms such as amino acids. Various bacteria can use all these forms as well as nitrite. Reservoirs. The main reservoir of nitrogen is the atmosphere, which is 80% free nitrogen gas. Key processes. The major pathway for nitrogen to enter an ecosystem is via nitrogen fixation, the conversion of N2 to forms that can be used to synthesize organic nitrogen compounds. The phosphorus cycle. Biological importance. Organisms require phosphorus as a major constituent of nucleic acids, phospholipids, and ATP and other energy-storing molecules, and as a mineral constituent of bones and teeth. Forms available to life. The most biologically important inorganic form of phosphorus is phosphate, which plants absorb and use in the synthesis of organic compounds. Reservoirs. The largest accumulations of phosphorus are in sedimentary rocks of marine origin. Key processes. Weathering of rocks gradually adds phosphate to soil. Some leaches into groundwater and surface water and may eventually reach the sea. So let's have a look at a case study. Case study involving nutrient cycling in the Hubbard Brook Experimental Forest. Since 1963, ecologist Jean Likens and colleagues have been studying nutrient cycling at the Hubbard Brook Experimental Forest in the White Mountains of New Hampshire. Their research site is a deciduous forest that grows in 6 small valleys, each drained by a single creek. Impermeable bedrock underlies the soil of the forest. The research team first determined the mineral budget of each of 6 valleys by measuring the input and outflow of several key nutrients. They collected rainfall at several sites to measure the amount of water and dissolved minerals added to the ecosystem. To monitor the loss of water and minerals, they constructed a small concrete dam with a V-shaped spillway across the creek at the bottom of each valley. This V-shaped spillway can be seen in Figure A. They found that about 60% of the water added to the ecosystem as rainfall and snow exits through the stream, and the remaining 40% is lost by evapotranspiration. Initial studies confirmed that internal cycling conserved most of the mineral nutrients in the system. For example, only about 0.3% more calcium leaves the valley via its creek than is added by rainwater, and this small net loss is probably replaced by chemical decomposition of the bedrock. Experimental deforestation of a watershed dramatically increased the flow of water and minerals leaving the watershed. Over 3 years, water runoff from the newly deforested watershed was 30 to 40% greater than in a controlled watershed. apparently because there were no plants to absorb and transpire water from the soil. Most remarkable was the loss of nitrate, whose concentrations in the creek increased 60-fold, reaching levels considered unsafe for drinking. The Hubbard Brook deforestation study showed that the amount of nutrients leaving an intact forest ecosystem is controlled mainly by the plants. Retaining nutrients in an ecosystem helps us to maintain the productivity of the system, as well as to avoid algae blooms and other problems caused by excess nutrient runoff. Ecosystems can recover naturally from most disturbances through stages of ecological succession. Sometimes, however, that recovery takes centuries, particularly when humans have degraded the environment. Tropical areas that are cleared for farming may quickly become unproductive because of nutrient loss. Mining activities may last for several decades, and the lands are often abandoned in a degraded state. Ecosystems can also be damaged by salts that build up in soils from irrigation and by toxic chemicals or oil spills. Restoration ecologists seek to initiate or speed up the recovery of degraded ecosystems. Restoration ecologists therefore work to identify and manipulate the processes that most limit recovery of ecosystems from disturbances. The first step in ecosystem recovery is physical recovery. To restore an open pit mine, like the one on the left-hand side of the slide, engineers may grade the site with heavy equipment to re-establish a gentle slope, spreading topsoil when the slope is in place. The next stage is biological recovery. The long-term objective restoration is to return an ecosystem as closely as possible to its pre-disturbance state. The image on the bottom part of the left-hand side of the screen shows an ecosystem near complete recovery. So let's have a look at some of the many restoration ecological projects taking place around the world. A good place to start is the Kissimmee River. In the 1960s, the Kissimmee River was converted from a meandering river to a 90-kilometer canal to control flooding. This channelization diverted water from the floodplain, causing the wetlands to dry up, threatening many fish and wetland bird populations. Kissimmee River restoration has filled 20 kilometers of drainage canal and re-established 24 kilometers of the original 167 kilometers of natural river channel. The project will also restore natural flow patterns, which will foster self-sustaining populations of wetland birds and fishes. Another project underway is the one in the succulent Karoo in South Africa. In the succulent Karoo desert region of South Africa, as in many arid regions, overgrazing by livestock has damaged vast areas. Private landowners and government agencies in South Africa are restoring large areas of this unique region, revegetating the land and employing more sustainable resource management. The image shows a small sample of the exceptional plant diversity of the succulent Karoo. Its 5,000 plant species include the highest diversity of succulent plants in the world. So another successful project has been the Mongatotiri project in New Zealand. In the past 30 years, weasels, rats, pigs and other introduced species have posed a serious threat to this region of New Zealand, and this has resulted in dwindling numbers of kiwis and groups of flightless birds. Now the goal of the Mongatotiri project is to exclude all exotic animals, well, pests, from a 3,400 hectare reserve. To do this, authorities have installed a specialised fence around the reserve, eliminating the need to continue setting traps and using poisons that can harm native wildlife. In 2006, a pair of critically endangered species of flightless rail were released into the reserve with the hope of re-establishing a breeding population. Another restoration project is occurring in coastal Japan. Now in coastal Japan, seaweed and grass beds are important nursery grounds for a wide variety of fishes and shellfish. Once extensive, but now reduced by development, these beds are being restored in the coastal areas of Japan. Techniques include constructing suitable seafloor habitats, transplanting seaweeds and seagrasses from natural beds using artificial substrates, bioremediation. Using organisms, usually prokaryotes, fungi or plants, to detoxify polluted ecosystems is known as bioremediation. Some plants and lichens adapted to soils containing heavy metals can accumulate high concentrations of toxic metals such as lead and cadmium in their tissues. Restoration ecologists can introduce such species to sites polluted by mining and other human activities, and then harvest these organisms to remove the metals from the ecosystem. For instance, researchers in the United Kingdom have discovered a lichen species that grows on soil polluted with uranium dust left over from mining. The lichen concentrates uranium into a dark pigment, making it useful as a biological monitor and potentially as a remediator. Scientists have sequenced the genomes of at least 10 prokaryotic species specifically for the bioremediation potential. One of the species, the bacterium Shionella oneidensis, appears particularly promising. It can metabolize a dozen or more elements under aerobic and anaerobic conditions. In doing so, it converts soluble forms of uranium, chromium and nitrogen to insoluble forms that are less likely to leach into streams or groundwater. Researchers at Oak Ridge National Laboratory in Tennessee stimulated the growth of Shionella and other uranium-reducing bacteria by adding ethanol to groundwater contaminated with uranium. The bacteria can use ethanol as an energy source. In just 5 months, the concentration of soluble uranium in the ecosystem dropped by 80%. The image on the right-hand side of this screen shows the results before and after addition of Shionella to uranium-contaminated mine pits. In contrast to bioremediation, which is a strategy for removing harmful substances from an ecosystem, biological augmentation uses organisms to add essential materials to a degraded ecosystem. To augment ecosystem processes, restoration ecologists need to determine which factors, such as chemical nutrients, have been lost from a system and are limiting its recovery. In alpine ecosystems of the western United States, nitrogen-fixing plants such as lupines are often planted to raise nitrogen concentrations in soil disturbed by mining and other activities. In other systems where the soil has been severely disturbed, mycorrhizal symbionts may be added to the soil. Because animals provide critical ecosystem services, including pollination and seed dispersal, restoration ecologists sometimes help wildlife to reach and use restored ecosystems.